Aloha. So a year ago, I got to go on a trip with Nassim Haramein to Egypt. And if you want to see that, you can, it's a similar presentation as this. If you Google Bruce Douglas Egypt, it'll pop up in YouTube or Google search. And me and Nassim go quite a few years back when he first, when I first heard about his work, and it was just amazing when I heard it. And Satya and I watched everything we could get on YouTube, and then I said, I got to meet this guy Nassim. And then next day I got a call, and Jamie Jamover is coming to Maui and wanted to do a presentation at her store. I said, well, yeah, I'm just calling that in. So Jamie came, gave a presentation, came back again, gave an advanced teaching, and then it was, I got to meet the real dude. And so I looked up online to see if he was giving any presentations, and he said 2 weeks he's giving a presentation at Studio Maui. And I go, what the heck? I call Studio Maui up, and they says, well, they didn't pay for the package. We thought they were doing publicity, and then I called the Sims people. They said, we thought they were doing publicity. Okay, I'll do publicity. We'll pack the place. Studio Maui had like 150, 200 people come for his presentation. He came back again, did a weekend delegate training on Maui that was some of you have attended. And I went on and did a 10-day emissary training with him in Mexico, and then recently, a year ago, to Egypt, and this time to Peru, and this time Satya got to come with me. Yay! So, so here we go. Start the recording. So, welcome to the ancient Egypt. Let's try that again. Flashback. They warned me about those flashbacks. Dude. Welcome to the ancient Peru and Bolivia download of Nassim Haramein. Thank you all for coming. This presentation, we're going to focus on what happened 12,000 years ago, the ancient ET civilization that was there. We're not going to focus on the Inca and the stories. We're going to look at what's way, way, way before the Inca and Spanish and everybody came to Peru. And look at what are the technologies that actually built it, and how is it done, and what does this mean to us today? So this story is basically about Nassim Haramein. This is his information, his download information that we received when 150 of us on the first half of the journey, and 100 went on to Bolivia, and these are his people, his delegates, his people who are trained, went to Peru and Bolivia to really examine the ancient sites of Bolivia and Peru. And a little bit about who is Nassim Haramein. Well, I kind of consider him the modern-day Nikola Tesla. What he's bringing to physics and understandings is on that level of information, and the ramifications of that will just carry on and on. So what Nassim is best known for is his black hole theory. He's really taken physics and understanding that in the center of everything there's a black hole, or what we prefer to call as a singularity, at the center, the unity point. And since we know everything in the universe is a fractal reality of itself, he's shown that we know there's a big black hole in the center of our known universe, and we know there's a black hole in the center of galaxies. Well, there's also black holes in the center of every sun, in the center of every planet, including Earth, in the center of every being, known as the heart center, in the center of every cell, called the nucleus, and the center of every atom, called the proton. And all this behaves as a toroidal field, and it's all a fractal reality of each other. So you can see the toroidal field, what we mean by that everything spins out from the center, it goes to the north and south pole, and comes back in again. And the Earth acts that way, the planets, our galaxy, and even in this image you can see our galaxy field. There's an event horizon at the edge of the black hole in the center, which is a field of gravitation. Physics doesn't know what gravity is, But Nassim has shown it's actually the black hole in the center of everything is the force of gravity that pulls it in. Spin is the force that pulls it out. So he's simplified all this crazy stuff into basically the black hole singularity energy going in and force going out, making equilibrium, creating an event horizon, which on this planet we call the planet Earth that we're standing on. And the inside, yes, is hollow. So Nassim has also solved Einstein's field equations. That's something he couldn't do in his lifetime. He added torque and spin to the field equation and basically solved them. And again, that's the curvature of space-time. You've heard about Einstein's thing. Well, it not only curves, but it spins as it torques down as it goes to singularity at the center. And that's the part he added in Einstein and solved Einstein's field equations. He's also known for his unified field theory, which basically unifies the macro and the microcosm. We've had a schism in this. Astrophysics kind of describes the astral level with a lot of big fudge factors, and quantum physics kind of describes the quantum level with some big fudge factors, but neither one describes the other. But since we're a fractal reality, we have to have a new physics that combines all of it. And so he's actually been able to prove in a perfectly linear relationship everything from the Planck's distance in the proton to the galaxy to our known universe by using simple formulas of, radius, log of radius, and log of mass, and actually shown this to be a linear relationship between those two, and as a whole new mathematics that basically kind of rewrites all of physics. He's also shown, since we all know that everything is one, well, he's shown that the mass of the universe, which they know that number, our known universe, right? Because there's more universes outside of that, but that's our known universe is as far as you can see before light bends and comes back on itself. So we're living in a big bubble called our known universe. And he's shown that the mass of the universe is equivalent to the, I'm going to say the vacuum fluctuation mass of a proton. That those two numbers and that's a different sort of concept, but he's actually shown mathematically that in the black hole of the proton, the center of the atom, is actually a representation of our whole known universe. So let's start our trip. That's Nassim, Satya, and I. And of course, we start out our trip. So then you enter in Cusco, and Cusco is like 11,000 feet up, right? So the first thing you feel is a little altitude sickness, and all that oxygen certainly feels good and makes you feel better, and it's so sexy having that thing on. That's not the picture you want to send home to mom. Now, Cusco is the center of the Inca Empire. It was also the center of the pre-Inca settlement, 12,000 years ago settlement. And as you walk through Cusco, you see these walls. That's the first thing you notice, these ancient walls, with no mortar between them, perfectly formed, can't even stick a credit card between them, out of hard granite. Not just granite, but granite that's got a high level of quartz in it, highly conductive granite. Very hard to cut and form. It crumbles when you do it. And the Inca did not have technology to cut this stuff. They weren't even barely in the Bronze Age. They had copper tools. They had some bronze. And you just can't, bronze is like hardness 3 in the hardness scale, and this stuff's like hardness 7, with 10 being diamond, the hardest thing on the planet. So, and as you walk through the streets of Cusco, you'll see, evidence all over the place of an ancient city. Even water troughs in the middle to carry the water, not just in dirt, but lined with this high quartz granite to take charged water and hold the charge in that as it travels through. You see the stores with, ancient walls around them. And these walls aren't just straight up and down. They actually angle in, not only on the inside, but on the outside. And this little wing right here for this building showed that the walls are not vertical. They actually angle in. Now, what an amazing amount of effort it would take to do that. If we were trying to lay that today, no one would do that. But there's piezoelectric and other reasons for that, and energetic reasons, and also it's a certain strength thing too, because the weight flies outward on it. So even the little shop where we did our laundry, even that's in one of these ancient walls, like all over Cusco. It's phenomenal. When you look closely at it, you'll see, how tight it is, how the forms are. And there's all sorts of levels of this craftsmanship. We saw incredibly flat ones, these sort of rounded ones, as we'll go through, you'll be seeing more. And we also see these little knob things sticking out from it. And it's like you see these little knobs quite often. You say, okay, what's that for? So we're going to come back to that at the end of the show. But the other thing you'll notice when you look at the walls is the bottom portion bulges more than the top portion, particularly at the lower part of the walls. Almost like it was liquid when you had it, and it when it dried, that kind of moved to the bottom portion. So a lot of the places when you look around, you'll see the bulge area more on the bottom than the top. So let's have Nassim, and Brian Forster is a researcher, has done lots of movies and information, and he was on us for the first part of the journey.
Yeah, sure, you can think of it that way, but as well you can think of the stone being in like potty state, like in a high energy plasma state. So when you place the weight on each other, they bulge. You see? And so as they dry up, as they cool off, they bulge. So then you would expect there'd be more bulge on the bottom, you see? Which you see. And you see, there's smaller stones on the bottom. Who does that? Right? Put the big ones on the bottom, especially they're heavy, right? You put the big ones on the bottom, the small ones on top. No, those guys put the big ones on top, right? So it's like completely different way of constructing, like nothing we would do. Right?
So the notches, looks like the notches.
The notches, yeah.
We'll see more obvious ones later.
That's like a big mystery. We're unclear.
Yeah, but again, the 4-degree angle was very important because the walls are pushing at each other like that. That creates a piezoelectric effect because this stone is high in quartz crystal. So when you have crystal under pressure, it produces energy, electricity, so-called electricity. So the pushing that way and pushing down on each other, and then when the right resonant sound is applied into the trapezoid, the whole thing vibrates as if it's a single piece of stone. That's why there's no mortar, because the stone has to be in contact with each other.
And then it's like a huge crystal oscillating, when it starts resonating, and then because it's piezoelectric, it's sending electromagnetic, like it's emitting electrons. And then so now you got like a huge like capacitance, inductor like that's emitting, energy across large distance.
So do you get that? So the stones touch each other, without mortar between, because these like resonance sound energy resonates through it. These are resonators, and this is going to be a theme we're going to talk about throughout the presentation, is about resonators and what that means. And here's some of the big stonework, huge blocks, not just square put together like we would do bricks, but with all sorts of interconnections and things to it. And other work where the stones are on top of other rocks and just phenomenal stonework that just like baffles us today as to how that could be done. And huge ones at various other places that are just like, monumental in their size. And even huger ones at the base of this one. So we're going to see lots of that in the presentation. But the question is, who did all this? With what technology? So you go to the museums in Cusco and you get some hints. Okay, that's not quite human, guys. That's the big head ETs. And there's even bigger ones, and there's all sorts of different species. This planet has been colonized before by other beings on this planet. We're not the only show, and we're not the only show that's been here, and what they've left for us is kind of obvious. Hello, we've been here before, and we'll be back. We're not gone. We're just waiting for you guys to grow up on your own so you can join the Galactic Federation and be a part of us, but you got to grow up first, or got to wait for you guys to catch up and kind of stop shooting at each other and being real. So different museums all have, so many of them, so not just finding in Peru, but we're finding them in Russia's finding them, they're finding in Mexico, in Chile they found some. They're finding them all over the world as we dig into the record. And here's even a bigger headed dude, and you look really big orbitals for eyes too. And when you look at all sorts, there's many, many, anomalies that go along with it. And you can see them in so many different forms and what they look like. And one of the main things that you see is there's no sagittal suture on these. The sagittal suture is the one on the back of your head right here. Okay? And these guys don't have that. It's different from any other type of form. But there's not just those. There's hybrids who have mated and have formed human and ET hybrids. And you see them and they have the sagittal suture in the back. Okay, but they still have the big head. Now, when you have the big head and you're half human, half mix, some certain things don't work out really good in that mixture. So what you see a lot of, which is phenomenal, everybody asks, showing things, you see these holes in the heads of the ET human hybrids, the ones with the sagittal sutures. And you look at it as like drill marks of high technology work. This is not just Stone Age type of stuff, right? And these are things that are carbon dated to 12,000 or more years ago when these civilizations were on the planet. Some back as far as 20,000 years as far as carbon dating. And you see this not just once or twice, but you see this whole thing all over the place. And, the curiosity, what was that? Well, one of the hybrid pharaohs of Egypt used to complain about headaches and stuff and pressure in the brain. And so what you find when they find these surgeries, these holes, is they find that it was covered with the precious metals, with silver and gold. It wasn't just there, but there's remnants of other metals, which of course dissolve over the years, but the remnants are still detectable. So what Nassim says is those were surgeries in order to relieve the pressure in the brain and put a thing there in order to let the pressure out so that these hybrids could function and not have headaches and be horrible. Because the records also in Egypt about hybrids, complaining about that whole sort of situation. And you even get some with frontal sutures. That's not human either. Both with big heads and small heads. So, these are what we've called the sun, what many cultures call the sun gods. They come from the sun. They come on ships. They come through the sun. These are the gods that, from our lore and stuff, because they weren't from here and they had technologies and ability, they were called gods. And so you see this all over the world, and Peru was included in one of those. And one of the more amazing things is a particular mummy found in the Nazca. And you hear the Nazca lines. I didn't really go there in this program, but it's a region, of great mystery of these big lines and these big figures in the desert from long ago. And this is one of the mummies they found in that area. And so recently and this is just published like a month or two ago, they really did in-depth studies and looked at it and looked at all the abnormalities of the whole thing, and how they looked and how they were different. And, many, of course, the head is obvious, but even the torso, you You notice there's no radius or ulna. There's only one bone in the forearm. You look at the fingers, there's 3 fingers. You look at the clavicle, it's entirely different. You look at the size of the torso and the body, this little teeny torso, and the rib cages are entirely different. You know, this is a humanoid, but definitely not Homo sapien as we know it. Even 3 fingers and a thumb, not 4 fingers. So when they put it all together and they try to say, what did this guy look like? Well, this is kind of what they come up with. So these were the builders of this, and the technologies came from off Earth, and they were brought here, and they had the ability to do that. But they lived in a very natural way as far as building buildings that were built out of the earth. They didn't like take concrete and pour it in steel and do all the crazy stuff we do. They took natural forms of material and used that for their temples and their dwellings. So what was the technology? Basically, if you're an ET dude and you fly here on a spaceship, right, you have to have an anti-gravity space drive in order to run that thing. Okay, it's just the way it is. If you're going to travel through space, you got to have a space drive. This is one of the things Nassim is working and researching and understanding and building anti-gravity space drives, so maybe one day we can lift off Earth and go other places. So in order to travel through time and space, you have to be able to warp time. You have to, like, you know, Einstein talked about the curvature of space-time. You have to warp space-time so then the time travel can actually happen. And when you do travel through, you actually travel through wormholes. You don't just travel, you know, for millions of miles, you know, barreling through space like we do with our rockets. You travel through a wormhole. Well, wormholes are through black holes, singularities. That's why the sun has a giant black hole in it. So if you want to travel to the Pleiades, you basically go through the sun here, you travel through a wormhole, you pop back out in the Pleiades, and that's how you travel. And you need to be able to warp space-time and be able to do that in order to have that travel ability. Same thing with Earth. We have a smaller singularity in the center of our Earth, so the big, huge ships can't do that, but the small ships can go in, so they often go through portals like Haleakala, volcanoes, different places that are portals for entry to go through the wormhole to get into the singularity at the center of the Earth and then travel through other places. So a little physics, because I want to explain like how these rocks are formed. Matter is basically 99.9% of this, what we call space, is disorganized matter we call plasma, right? And so plasma is the highest energy state, and as it solidifies, it becomes a gas down to a liquid to a solid. Now this isn't temperature, it's energy. So throw the heating idea out, it's not temperature. But that's how the 4 states of matter. And so we think of plasma because plasma is created when electricity goes through and lightning happens, it forms plasma. Plasma is the stuff of the universe, the disorganized stuff that hasn't been formed into any sort of matter as we know it. Now in the ancient Vedas of India, they have all sorts of descriptions of what they call Vimanas. These are spaceships. And the way they looked is kind of the way they made their temples. It's the same sort of things. There's very explicit descriptions of their energy field, how they were done, and how they looked. And there's all sorts of lore within India about the Vimanas when the gods were here and they had their ships. And so people have taken that and really made drawings through the ages to try to understand, what it looks like. And what it looks like is a toroidal field, a spinning energy with poles at the top and bottom that creates the very center, creates a black hole. So they're creating a mechanical thing to spin energy, to spin plasma, and create the boundary conditions of a black hole within. So this is kind of how that toroidal field looks, right? You can see that it spins out from the equator, kind of like our galaxy does, where you see everything spinning out. It then goes to the event horizon, which is the edge of that toroidal field, and then it returns back to the singularity, the black hole in the center afterwards. So when you look at our galaxy has that very sort of field. At the horizon, there's a field that goes out, and it goes out to the edge of the event horizon of our galaxy, and then all the stars find their way back to the North and the South Pole, where they get recycled back in the middle again. It's self-perpetuating. This field is found around humans, with the heart being in the center, an toroidal field. It's found around everything. It's the basic fundamental principle of the black hole, singularity, and the energy fields that make everything work. There's another representation of the black hole in the center, the curvature of space-time at the north and south poles returning back in. Kind of a picture of our galaxy where everything spins out from the center and returns back to the singularity at the top. Black hole is both creation and destruction. It's one and the same. Here's the energy field around a human being with that same toroidal field. And we know about our kundalini and our spine and our chakras, and all this lines up with that same energy field, that you'll see. And the heart math people have done wonderful things to register the energy coming out from our equator that can be, measured 20 meters away from a person. They can actually measure the energy field rising out from the heart center, from our singularity at the heart. Many people also know this as the Merkaba principle. And the spinning Merkaba, it's the same principle in another geometric representation. So remember, Nassim's whole piece is that we know we're a fractal reality, that everything is one, and we're a fractal reality. So what Nassim has done is combined our spiritual concepts and given it the physics and the science to go with it. We call something a miracle until we understand, what it is. Our cell phones are a miracle, but once you know there's some technology in there, it's just technology, it's not a miracle. So the miracle of life, what is the technology? What is the field? What is the energy that makes that? And so you can see the whole reality all the way from our known universe to our sun, to our planet, to the human, to the cell, to the atom, all the same as our known universe. That same field, the toroidal field, is found there with a black hole in the center. And I'm telling you all this so you can understand what the power object was that was running these civilizations. You see also that same toroidal field, which they can measure around our Milky Way, our galaxy, and the X-ray, gamma ray radiation is coming at the top of the bottom of the event horizon, where the energy is coming back to singularity at the center. And you see this not just in the X-ray emissions of our galaxy, but you see it in quasars and pulsars and collapsars and all those R's, And we know that when the supernova happens, right, the whole sphere collapses into the center. Okay, singularities don't explode, they actually collapse, send out all sorts of energy field and particles, but what's left after that happens is a black hole. And science thinks that it's they're creating the black hole in the center, but none of the black hole is there all along. It's just everything expands. Our universe is expanding, our planet is expanding. Plate tectonics is bunk. It's actually expanding Earth that's happening. And it reaches a certain point, and then the bubble pops, and it collapses on itself and goes back to the singularity at the center and recycles. And so you see that in space. That's going to happen with our planet one day. It happens with us when we pass away. And you can see even in the cell division, the sacred geometries are rising in cell division as things open up, when it goes from, the fields, and even the sacred geometry that rises as, atoms multiply, and you'll see the flower life pattern happening. Another thing that Nassim has come up with is what is the structure of space-time. What we call the vacuum out here isn't really a vacuum. It's highly organized and infinitely dense. It's the opposite of what we think. We are an energy potential moving through an infinitely dense, highly organized vacuum field. And that vacuum field has a structure to it that all sacred geometries arise out of. It's the 64 tetrahedron. It's a tetrahedron 64 times. I mean, the flower of life is a feminine representation of that. If you draw circles through the 64 tetrahedron, you get the flower of life. If you take the 64 tetrahedron and you look at it from one angle to the other, you see the Sri Yantra mandala inside the 64 tetrahedron. It's another representation, and one hanging right up here in the room. Thank you, Adrian Avocado. So here you see the flower of life arising as the cells divide, organizing in the 64 tetrahedron grid. So I talked about the toroidal field of a space drive. Well, it resembles a planet. There's waveforms that come out from the center. Remember those Vimanas I showed you? It looks like this design right here, where there's energies coming out the poles, north and south pole. There's waveforms coming out from the center. You can see our galaxy is the same way, follows these wave patterns. As the planets arise out, they actually go up and down like this through the equator, following these wave patterns coming out from the singularity at the center. And this same thing is found, in all life forms. So what Nassim has done is created mechanically spinning plasma in a toroidal field. So plasma is created by basically zapping lasers at argon and creating the matter, just like I was saying, lightning bolts create plasma. You can create that inside of a vacuum field, or what we call a vacuum, without air, and spin it electronically at close to the speed of light, and you create the energy field of a black hole, which then has forces and powers that can do it. So in the ancient times, in Peru, they didn't, again, 12,000 years ago, they didn't do iconography, and they didn't have images of gods, so much of this stuff. They did in Egypt, but in Peru, they didn't. But in Egypt, you see this iconography during the dynastic period of Egypt, not the early Egypt, but the dynastic Egypt. They made all these images of gods, and everywhere you see it's about the sphere. The gods are holding spheres. They got a sphere above the head. They have the power of the sphere. It's all the power object, and you see this, all around the world. So, obvious, all the gods have a sphere. They're passing spheres. They're working spheres. They're using spheres as power objects. They put these nice things on their heads to hold the spheres. So what this is what I'm calling a plasmasphere. We needed a word for it. A singularity doesn't sound sexy enough. So I asked Nassim, what do you think of the word plasmaspheres? It's a sphere of spinning plasma. It's an energy field, just like we're creating in the boundary conditions of a black hole. So I'm making up a word, plasmaspheres. For what are these things? They always say it's the sun. Well, the sun represents that energy to us. It's our main source of gravitation, of energy, so they always say it's a sun disk. Well, the sun disk was actually something different. It was the power object that they had back then, and it's that representation. It's right here in our face. All over the place you see the gods, having it, being able to control it. He who controls the plasmasphere, and this is one of the big head ET gods of Egypt, and he said, no, quit worshiping all these deities. Just, it's the power of the sphere that's important. So you see that all over the place. And even, there's a Göbekli Tepe, which is a new place that was been really discovered and pulled out in Turkey, which was absolutely phenomenal. That they've positively dated things to 12,000 years old. So science can no longer deny this whole timeline that there was civilizations here, because here this whole place has been positively dated to 12,000 years. You can't date rock. You can only date organic matter. So it's a problem when you have rocks to say, well, when was this built? Well, I don't know. It's a rock. It's millions of years old. You can't date it. Only the carbon footprints and the beings and other things that are there can you date. So this was like very quickly buried, it's back in the day, whether they buried it themselves or there was an explosion that buried it, it was buried. And, that moment, everything was frozen in time. They were able to date it. And there you'll see the same thing. You'll see these images of the sphere, but there also you see the gods, the sun gods, holding the purse. And the purse is the same thing. It's the sphere. You sometimes need to put it in something. You can hold it above your head, but most people need to put it in something to kind of insulate it and put it in a capacitor box. And so you see this in Turkey. You see this in the Sumerian gods. You'll see it in Mayan iconography. And you see it really obvious in some more Mayan and pre-Mayan iconography. So it was about the sphere. So that was the power object, and he who controls it, these things don't operate, through a mouse and a keyboard. They operate through consciousness. They connect. You're one with the singularity. So it's just like we're finding now, or as Nassim talks about with spaceships, again, the people driving it become one with the singularity, and through consciousness, they're driving it. And now that people are coming forward with like Roswell and the crash in Area 51, and people are coming forward describing what the ship looked like, and they said there were just pads sitting there for the beings to touch. But there weren't like piles and knobs and switches and keyboards and mouses like we have now. It was an organic thing with consciousness that was operated, and they connect through consciousness. And with that, you can plasmify rock. You can start turning rock from solid into a semi-liquid state in order to form it, melt it, and move it. You can also create anti-gravity. So we talk about 12,000 years ago, it ended with a cataclysm. And we all know the story of Atlantis. It basically blew up, sunk. And the lore that we have, most of the information we have about Atlantis actually comes from Plato, because he met with the Egyptian priesthood who knew about that, and he actually wrote it down and preserved it. So a lot of we have, which is written form, came from Plato. Plato's information as well, it didn't just sink, it blew up. The people there got corrupt, intentions weren't pure, and it blew up. It self-destructed. And singularities are all connected with each other. Here's a representation of Atlantis as it was played out, and many other forms have talked about the concentric circles, different levels of people. Only the priesthood, the high beings could be in the center circle, and the very center was the power object, the singularity, which was the mother crystal of this planet, the heartbeat and the really big thing. And Plato's information is that basically this event happened 12,000 years ago, the sinking of Atlantis. And even you can look in the records in the ice in various places and see what the temperature was of the planet at different points in our history. And you can see that we had an ice age up until about 15,000 years ago. And then we went through about a 3,000 year period of some really nice weather on this planet. Things got organized and stable, and we had good weather. And then you can see about 12,000 years ago, there was a sudden drop in the temperature of the planet, like kaboom. And it lasted for about 1,200 years in our history. And then kaboom, the energy rises, the temperatures rise back up. And you can see from, 11,000 years ago until present, we had really stable temperatures on this planet. In fact, if you think there's global warming happening, look at that graph, and you can actually see we've actually cooled a little bit, not warmed. So that's why they call it climate change now. They got busted and can't call it global warming anymore. So that's, the big thing is the cataclysm. And particularly when I was in Egypt, I was just like mesmerized with what was the cataclysm. Earthquakes and shaking, that's not what I see. I see all the temples blown up from the inside out. I see wherever the singularity, the holy of holy, the power object, the center of the temple was, those are the temples that were most destructed and blew up. The dominant paradigm basically feels like there was a comet that hit the Earth, and there's debris that's spread around the planet in different places, and that's the debris pattern of where the debris was found. And through that, they're thinking it was a comet. Well, a comet's an ice ball. It could have hit the planet. It could have blown debris. Certainly, it could have shaken. But when I look at the real records, I see all sorts of things still standing, but I see the temple blown up from the inside. It's really obvious even in the Great Pyramid of Giza. Those capstones on the outside, weren't just mined way up there on top. That was hard to get up there. It was actually, there was laying in rubble on the ground. There's a huge explosion inside of the pyramids that blew the capstones off and left them in rubble, moved some of the rocks. The center of we all know there's a sarcophagus, the so-called sarcophagus. They finally blast their way into the Great Pyramid, and they find the sarcophagus is empty and the lid crumbled and a big hole in the side of it, and try to say, well, the grave robbers got there before us, but wait a minute, this not a grave. Those sarcophaguses and stuff of Egypt were to hold the singularities and the power. So in India, you'll see all sorts of iconography. This is in a temple wall, and what's that look like? It looks like the god is wielding something that looks like a nuclear bomb, and you see a mushroom cloud rising up with spears coming out of it, like some big destructions. Well, there is, of course, lore in India that the gods had some wars. They were warring up in the sky, and the Vimanas were fighting each other, But, whatever happened, after the Great Cataclysm, we basically went about from 12,000 to 6,000 years ago with no civilizations on this planet, wiped out. Cataclysm also caused an extinction of a lot of animals. We had a minor extinction, and in a short amount of time, these animals came back again. And it was until about 6,000 years ago that the first civilizations appeared in Egypt and Sumeria, and not too long after that in China. So all of a sudden, that period. But for 6,000 years, we didn't have civilizations. What I was looking at, I was really calling in, so what was this cataclysm? I don't buy there were floods. We have the story of Noah's flood. We have, a lot of cultures have the story of the great floods that happened and the earth changes that happened. We have the records of it. But what I saw was when Atlantis went off, all the singularities, like Nassim talks about, there were probably 1,000 of these, or maybe thousands of these singularities on the planet 12,000 years ago. And just like all of our singularities, are interconnected, they interact with each other, right? All the singularities in the cosmos are connected through wormholes. We know that in the cosmos. Well, that's wormhole also passes between humans. That's how we're all one species, all one beings. We're all connected through wormholes, through our singularity. And so with wormholes, all black holes are connected to each other. And what I realized was, what came to me was the realization that what happened was that when the mother crystal of Atlantis blew up, whether it was because a comet hit or because they blew it up, something happened. All the other singularities, plasma spheres, were connected. And they all imploded at the same time all around the planet, showing this whole pattern of all the temples that we see being blown up from the inside out. And we're going to see more of that in Peru as we go through. And when they would implode, they're going to put out some massive pulses of energy. And what's that pulses of energy going to do? Well, it's basically going to create something that would look like a nuclear winter to us, that would annihilate all life forms in the area around them. Right? And so this was what came to me, and in talking with Nassim about it too. The imploding singularities. And it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Nassim talks about that the Galactic Federation, which is, there's a Galactic Federation out there. We're not the only show in town. And they are in full control to be able to stop a comet from hitting this planet, or controlling things to explode. And Nassim talks about that the ETs haven't been letting us use our nuclear bombs since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They've been shutting them down every time we try to use it. And the Cold War basically ended because they wouldn't let us use these things anymore. And so this was, this is what came to me. And it came to me really powerfully when I was in Egypt. And so, off of nuclear winter and on to Peru. So now you know with the black hole, the power object, how they did this. You'll start seeing a picture of what we're going to see and what that civilization must have been like, where the sun gods mixing with the humans, living together as one. And like I said, Nassim said the Galactic Federation could have stopped something like that, could have stopped the cataclysm, but humans had to grow up. We're a species, and it's time for us, if we keep worshiping these sun gods on the outside of us, as being the main dudes to worship, rather than realizing, no, we're one with that, and we are one with the universe, with the universal energy, God, whatever our concept is, and by whatever terminology we call it. We had to grow up. And so actually these civilizations had to be cleared off this planet in order for the humans to not have this technology that we're not ready for. Because what would we do if we had one of these right now? We'd build a bigger bomb or something, right? We'd use it incorrectly. So it's been withheld from us until we actually reach a level of consciousness where we're ready to handle such things, and we're ready for that point in our life, and we're ready to join our galactic beings and become one with our galactic family. So, Sacsayhuaman. Of course, we always said it sound like sexy woman, but Sacsayhuaman. They try to call it a fortress. They try to blame this on the Incas building it, but no, this was before the cataclysm, 12,000 years ago. These things were built. And it's this amazing zigzag of stone walls like this, and you get up close to it, you see just the massive size of these walls and the funny zigzag of them. Again, all these things are built for resonance and resonators. They were built for particular reasons. That zigzag in that field, Nassim said it has special acoustic effects, in the way it was done. It wasn't just randomly, I think we'll do a zigzag wall. They had big intentions. And even when you look at the walls and you look at the bulges in it, you see the bulges at the bottom. Well, again, these stones came quarried from quarries that were 50 kilometers away, They didn't pull them with vine ropes, rolling them on logs they didn't have, They used anti-gravity, using the singularity in order to move the stones. And they forced the energy into the stones in order to, directed the energy in order to plasmify the rock and turn it from a solid into a semi-liquid. So then when they shove them into place, they would perfectly form with each other. They'd bulge a little bit because they're still a little bit liquid, so they'd get some bulges on them. And a lot of the bulge would end up more at the bottom than the top. You'll see this all over the place. And if you have a anti-gravity space drive, you can levitate things. So you can move those rocks from a quarry and just float them over like a big marshmallow and place them around. So Sacsayhuaman, this is how you look at it from the sky. It's really incredible spread. There's an amphitheater on the left-hand side. There's a whole rock garden of some blown-up stuff in the middle. There's this amphitheater-looking piece with the stone walls in between. And the right-hand side, there's this amazing piece. They try to call it a fortress, but it's actually an energy plant. It was a specially designed thing. It looks more like a microcircuit. But that's it from the air. And this is what they call the fortress. No. that was actually used for charging water. There's water channels coming out from that and moving through all these different patterns. Doesn't that kind of look like a microcircuit board, like an integrated circuit? It's a power grid piece. It's used in creating, harmonics and energy fields and charging water and being a source of energy field. Anything but a fortress. And here you can see some of the water channels. Originally each one of those things had water channels moving out, and they're moving water in circles, and they're moving waters without pumps. The pumps was an organic type of thing of moving the water fields underneath. And just a incredible piece. And in the center, I said there was this kind of area of big rocks that were all like blown this way and blown that way. And here you see a staircase that's upside down, right? So this was the spot where the Holy of Holies, the singularity, the plasma sphere, whatever name you want to call it, was there. The biggest rocks, the biggest pieces, the most important part of the temple blown to pieces. Rolled over, huge things. You see this everywhere we're going to go. You see this sign of the explosion, the sign of the cataclysm. You see the bases sitting there with all sorts of carvings and, in the rock, and you see a lot of signs of melted looking rock with all sorts of, the rock is all funny shapes and stuff, and more signs of upside down staircases, obviously. Other places you see these same things right side up, and here there are a bunch of them upside down, signs of the explosion. Another place in Sacsayhuaman is, the cave, which is underneath this whole rock formation. Again, on top you see all sorts of staircases and interesting things, of what was once there. But underneath there's this incredible cave. And on the cave, there's a thing that looks kind of like a throne. So Nassim says this is where the singularity was kept. They would hold it in special places. This is, things were used for that. But in the Incas' time, they used this chamber for their mummification because it's still charged. Everywhere the singularities were, the plasma spheres were, it still holds an incredible charge. It's still powerful. And so one of our missions was to charge the field wherever we go with a 64 tetrahedron crystalline grid. And in this case, everybody got a chance to sitting on the throne where the singularity was, where the Incas were doing their mummification processes, and feeling the charge and the energy from that. So everyone got a chance to just sit with it and experience it. So I'm wearing one of these right here. And you guys, the crystal pops out. And what this is, it's a specially grown crystal. And it's put inside of a cage and this little mounting thing right here. The crystal is in a tetrahedron form. And it's specially grown. It takes about 2 years to grow it under very special conditions. So it's highly polarized and highly in straight lines in the way it's done. And then it's cut in a certain way using the certain axes of the cut in order to maintain the power grid. And there's a certain point on the top where the energy comes out of the tetrahedron, and it has to be cut. And nobody really understands cutting a crystal like Nassim understands. Then it's put inside of this inside of a cage, and inside of that there's silicone bumpers to allow it to oscillate and not be dampened by setting it down on something. So it's kind of floating inside of the cage. And then it's put next to a singularity energy, a spinning plasma field and a toroidal field electronically spinning to create the boundary conditions of black hole in the center that creates a really strong charge. And this is a artist's rendition of how the device sort of looks, electronically doing it. Now this is different from the organic, natural ones that the ETs have, but we don't have that technology on this planet. We have this other crude stuff of electronics and devices, and so it creates that. Inside is a spinning toroidal plasma field, and the crystals are put next to that in order to get that charge. And afterwards, some of you can hold this and feel the energies coming off of it. And it's really quite amazing. They also have little magnets inside the corners so that you can put them together and create a 64 tetrahedron grid, which for Nassim is the underlying structure of the vacuum, structure of space-time, that all sacred geometries arise out of and return to. And it's the basic fabric of, the organization of what we call the vacuum. So we had one of these, and actually we had 3 of them on the trip, 64 tetrahedrons, as well as all of us on the trip had our singularities. So we used that in ceremony, and part of our mission, it wasn't a vacation, it was a mission. It was to try to recharge the grid of where these singularities, plasma spheres, once were, and bring the charge back to the grid. So at Sacsayhuaman, or these little tetrahedrons carved in the mountain, I was like, what a great place to put a 64 tetrahedron. So you see us many times doing ceremonies and energy things to use these crystals and recharge the grid. Not too far from Sacsayhuaman was these incredible salt mines, where salt water is just pouring out of the earth and has been doing for thousands of years, and then they dry them on the hillside to create salt. Obviously, if you're going to have an empire, you have to be able to have salt. That's one of the basic things. So voila, there's a salt, nothing else like it anywhere around, but at this one point on the planet, there's salt water pouring out of the earth. There's more of that also in Tibet and other interesting places in the mountains. And so these are drying pools right here where there are evaporation ponds in the hillside. Just really a marvel to look at how many years old those may be. So there's the area Pisac, which is a national park with some incredible terraces. And you'll see these terraces like all over Peru. These are highly refined terraces, but everywhere you look on the hillsides, all around Lake Titicaca and areas of the Sacred Valley and the area around Cusco, you see all the hillsides terraced. Now, these were obviously not done by humans. It's not something that, it's like terraforming. It's like, the level of precision of the walls, precision of the terracing. If we're going to terrace hillsides, they're not going to be perfectly flat. They're going to be all following and doing different things. This was like, serious terraforming of the earth. You'll find this everywhere. And what Nassim talks about is this is probably done from a ship where they're taking the energy and they're terracing it, because some of the places you wouldn't have gotten a bulldozer in there to do all that stuff, and dynamite and all the things we would do in order to create these terraces. And when you hike down from the temples, we took a beautiful hike going down this, and then we came across this beautifully preserved temple, residence temple area. And, you'll just see the precision of the rock and everything in it. You see these knobs all on top. Well, those were used to actually hold down the roofs, because they would put thatched roofs and stuff up there, and because they didn't have a lot of wood, but they had thatching, and they'd had some wood here as well, and they'd make the roofs with it, and so those knobs were to hold it down. But you'll see everywhere these chambers. You see those trapezoidal shaped things? You see that all around the pre-Inca areas. They're not windows, they're not little quite storage units. What they actually were resonance chambers. And when you ohm into them, you find they're all tuned to the same frequency, which is acoustically impossible. How do you tune those so when you're doing it? And in fact, when you start ohming into one, someone with their head in another one, several down, can actually hear the ohming. And so wherever we went, we would go and we would ohm into these and hit this frequency. especially when you ohm into the 64 tetrahedron one. That's like the supercharged spot. But it was just so exciting to be there and feel the resonance of it and actually bring the resonance back into it, Because you can imagine each one of these little chambers were kind of like a place where a mini singularity was held, They were tuned. They were acoustics. They were harmonic. It was about sound healing and vibrations and resonance. And they were resonating chambers. And so they would have one of the mini singularities in there. They weren't just, places to put your books, They had special meaning. And you'll see this all over the place. And of course, in this temple complex, there's this one rock area here where the rock is like melted, liquefied and poured, and, it forms a whole nother sorts of thing. This, as we look at it, is the place where the Holy of Holies, the singularity of the plasma sphere was, pre-cataclysmic. And when it went off and destroyed this part of the temple, it vitrified, liquefied the stone and created like a glass-like membrane over the whole thing. And wherever you see these things, it's always water. It was about charging the water. You see channels coming out from where the singularity, it disappears underground, pops back up, and it's flowing water today. It's like a spring that's still flowing thousands of years later. It's still flowing in this beautiful chamber. And the stones in it are not just rock, normal rock. It's this very high crystalline, very high in quartz granite. Because once you charge the water in the singularity, you want to keep that charge. You don't want to just ground it out by the earth. So you see these channels all over the place, of this certain type of stone they used in order to hold the charge and send that water. And when you start growing plants with that sort of charged water, that's, you get some super agriculture happening. Right? And you got to have some agriculture if you can have a civilization. We came further down that hill in a hike and found another village. The rocks were more crude. They weren't as finely carved, but you still see, now they try to say the Inca built this, but you look at, the flattening of some of the rocks. They could have taken some rocks from someplace else and relocated them, but I think this is all still pre-cataclysmic, and the Inca just found it and used it for their villages and their things. You'll see signs underneath of some of the very fine rock work as the base and other rock on top. So the pre-cataclysmic culture didn't just build, the really fine super rock stuff. I think they also built the other stuff. But it's hard to tell over the years the changes and stuff that may have happened. So this was an amazing place called Moray. It's actually a volcanic cinder cone up on top of a mountain, up on top of a hill. And these are cylinder cones that then had terraces built all around them. Now we know that a volcano is a portal, right? Because it's coming out from deep magnet. It's a portal where often ships come in and out of, right? In order to reach the singularity at the center of the planet and go through wormholes to other places. So what's this look like to me? Well, it looks like a subwoofer to me. Yeah, that's what I called it. I was like, boy, if you get the singularity in the middle of that thing, get it vibrating, that could be some serious dancing going on. I don't know what they were doing, but I'm sure it was good. I'm sure it made the Grateful Dead look like Dick and Jane. So you look in there close and, you can see the perfect concentric walls and flattening. Everything in sevens. 7 down below, 7 above, 7 on the hillside, the magic number 7. And, the local archaeologists try to say that was done, they would be growing corn and hybriding corn there. And so it was for growing corn. I don't think so. It had a much deeper meaning. And the center of that thing, when you're in the middle of it, is just phenomenal. We weren't allowed to go there, but we snuck in. Spirit wanted us to go in there. And of course, what do you do when you go in the center? Well, you form a circle. We connect our crystals in a circle. One hand we have our crystal, and the other hand receiving, and charge up the energy and do a prayer and a meditation and reactivate what was there, reactivating the grid, and bringing the life back to the planet of what it must have been rocking back in the day. And when I say it's all about the water, well, every place you see the springs, you see these special walls and special terraces and special things for the water. You see those little trapezoidal things up on top? Well, that's where the singularities were put. That's for charging the water. And running the spring water through that field, would not only give you long life, it makes your plants grow like crazy, and the water, when it came down, wouldn't just come down. They'd always make sure it splashed onto some rocks down below. And the rocks it splashed on were the highest of quartz contents. Just like when water splashes, it ionizes the water and gives its own charge. That's what the water coming down a mountain and a river brook does. And here, 12,000 years later, the Twin Falls are still flowing perfectly even. And talk about some engineering there that is still level and flat 12,000 years later. Amazing. And of course, the singularity, the 64 tetrahedron goes there. We also put it in the water to charge up the water for the flow. So
Right.
let's hear what
But
Nassim
as
has
well,
to say.
Imagine like the water coming off all of these temples, the energy of the water being like over the top, right, with the crystal energy source, like changing the molecular water, and then irrigating the land with that, then the land gets charged, and the food is charged, right? So you're eating the food, so you're charging your cells, you're drinking the water, so you get into these very, very high state of connectivity with the structure of space-time, even if you are not necessarily inclined, right? And this is what we have to reestablish, right? We have to restructure the water of the earth, right? And this plan is the plan of the laboratory, the resonance, the Taurus Tech, which is like our laboratory, right? Very soon we will be able to charge significant amount of water and let it flow to the oceans, right? And charge the veins of the earth, the water, of the streams, the rivers, the ocean, and start, because a small amount of very highly charged water has a large impact, so we're gonna be able to flow. And then as I was telling you, when we're basically doing a modern version of what used to be here, right? Because we're gonna make pipes that you're gonna be able to install on your house that's gonna charge the crap out of your water, right? So then all the water in your pipes in your house are gonna be charged. Your whole house is gonna start, oscillating, right? And then it's gonna charge the pipe. It doesn't just charge forward; it charges backward the water. So the water is gonna charge back towards the municipality, right? Start charging the municipality, and more houses in that municipality that has the pipes, more, and then people are gonna start feeling it, because then we're gonna irrigate the fields and so on, and then the food is gonna be arc charged food, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So if I drink the charged water and make my pee,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah. You can be everywhere. Mark your territories. But you see, it's not just, it's so it's really important, you all have the crystals now, and we wear them, it charges the water in your body, but even actually the more powerful use of the crystal is to stick it under your water at night when you're not wearing them, and changing the molecular structure of the water in your house and then drinking that. you know, because then it's coming from the inside out, right? And it's changing you inside.
Yeah. So
So what Nassim is talking about is he's taking these crystals, putting them in a spiral pipe arrangement so the water spins through the pipe past the crystals and gets charged. And he's working on getting a mass production in order to get the price of the crystals down and actually be able to put something in your pipe to give this energy to charge the water, which is like what you're seeing here. It's all about charging that water. So the water is charged not only that way, but also in the delivery system as it goes around. So you'll see all over the place, you'll see these channels for the water, right, of this very special high quartz thing carrying the charged water, because if you just ran it through a ditch, it would get charged, get grounded out to the earth. So you want to have it in a vessel, have it in a special pipe. And so you see these channels delivering water to all these special terraces all over the place, you know, and really, you know, what Nassim finds when he charges the water with these crystals is you get like 4 times the growth out of various plants. So that's what he talks about, is charging, putting it underneath your glass of water and charging that water and then drinking it. You know, so you're taking, because we're basically water. That's our conductor that runs everything in our body. It's all about the water. Here it's all about the water. And you just see that everywhere you go. And even the way the water channels down, you can see these little lines in the side there where the water comes down. And even those are little channels in order to bring the water down. So it comes down, hits a plate and splashes and keeps the charge going and goes from one to the other. So you can imagine what type of growth they got in their plants and what they were able to grow here, you know, using the charged water. And you'll see, you know, these agricultural ponds, you see these chambers coming down for the water to drop and hit this very special stone. Here's 4 falls still perfectly level and flowing completely evenly thousands of years later. Talk about some engineering. Sorry, the Inca did not build this. And you see it coming down, again, water coming down, splashing, hitting a stone, and then rolling its way down. And the terracing in some of the places is just magnificent. I mean, it's like, wow, you know. Maybe the Inca did some repairs and put it all together and used the water that was flowing. It still holds the charge, even though the singularities aren't there. But, you know, they didn't build these. This is terraformed. This was high technology used to create these. And you see this pattern, which you'll see later, of this certain sort of square thing. And we'll look at that later. But, you know, all the water, the water is precious. Water is everything. So these springs that are flowing and still flowing all these years later, well, the 64 tetrahedron goes in order to charge that water and do our part in like bringing back the charge of what was originally there. And in this same place, there was a hillside here where there were these carvings out of the side. But again, at the base of that, you see this same like vitrified stone, this glaze over the side of the stone, like something heated and melted and poured it. And, you know, obviously this is a very special place where probably the Holy of Holy was. You know, the terrace walls, everything else are still in great shape, but the main temple exploded to pieces and rubble down below. Right? The same pattern we see in Egypt and here and other places of the cataclysm. What was the cataclysm? And it was exciting for us because we saw this stone here that had the same scoop marks that you see in Egypt. Like you see these scoop marks, you know, and the unfinished obelisk in Egypt where they had big scoops coming out in order to carve it. So it start to understand what the technology may have been, you know, scooping it out before it's being finally formed, you know. Obviously, you can feel like it's in a semi-plasma state, semi-liquefied in order to do these sort of scoops. Also on the ground down here, you saw these giant, huge stones, you know, that were originally way up on the hillside laying on the ground, you know, 500 meters away from where it originally was. Like, how did that stone get from there to way over here? You see several of these huge stones on the ground level. Well, when you climb up the mountain, and we went up that climb to find the place where the main temple was, you see these massive stones of the original temple, and there's only one wall left. The other 3 walls were blown, and you find the pieces and the fragments all over the ground down below. But the technology of this was just amazing. You see these big stones and these little ones in between, and these are like, 400 tons each. I mean, the scale is just immaculate. But when they had the energy field of it, that's what they needed it for. Olai Tumbo. Olai Tumbo is the name. So at the entrance to the temple, what do you see? You see these resonance chambers still in good shape, still there. And it's the same thing when you'd ohm on one side, you could hear that ohm all the way down on the other side through the resonance of the whole thing. And it almost kind of reminds me of like a Tibetan prayer wheels, where you walk in, you spin the prayer wheels as you come to the temple. Well, this is your ohm in the chambers as you're walking into the temple. It kind of had that same feeling for me, for something special at the entranceway. All these still intact, but the main temple gone, blown to pieces. And just the technology and the form of this and some of the rocks interconnecting to hold that energy in between are just like, wow. Look at that. How did that happen? So, very carefully tuned, certain varied geometry is really right on each one. And they all ohmed the same note. Tell me how that happens. And then you look across the wall, look across the valley to the other side of the valley, and you see this, what is this on the side? Well, they called it grain storage on the side of the hill. Like those are where they stored their grain, because the Inca were very big on storage. They really made a point of having enough food stored for famines. And potato being a big crop, it stores a long time, and they charged it up, and they had serious storage. But why would you put storage on the desolate side of a hillside where you'd have to major climb up there to put it there, unless you had a spaceship or something to transport it from one side to the other? So I don't know what that was. I don't know about grain storage. And then you go to the town down below, and just like we saw in Cusco, you look at the town and the big stones in the walls, you realize, oh my God, this was a 12,000-year-old settlement, pre-cataclysmic, and they're repurposing and reusing it and brought back to life. So talk about some of the oldest inhabited, places, is still being used. The rocks are just continuing, and you saw all sorts of evidence as you walked through the town of these, big walls from before. Well, Machu Picchu. Let's go to Machu Picchu. That's the icon. That's the incredible thing. And the way you get there is by train, because the valley it goes through is really incredible. And it's such a deep valley that the train has these skylights on it up above, so you can see your way in. And there's a whole little city formed below Machu Picchu with hotels and restaurants and everything to do it. And as you take the tourist train, well, you got to get a little entertainment. So, they have all sorts of entertainment going through, and fashion shows and all sorts of incredible stuff. Yeah, they even had the one sweater you can wear 8 different ways, which we brought a bunch back with us. Commercial plug for Mandala Creations. You want to get this? Come on down. And see the alpaca sweaters that you can wear 12 ways. 3. Oh, they had 3. Not quite a mesh wrap jacket yet. And then you get to Machu Picchu. Long bus ride going up the mountain to the zigzag, and you get to this iconic location of just the most incredible piece of pre-Inca creation you could ever imagine, on the very top of a mountain. And you look at that mountain, and you can tell that mountaintop was cut off. It was terraformed. right? It wasn't just happened to be flat up there. I don't think so. It's not what any of the other rocks show. But talk about a magnificent place. It's like, wow. And you get up there and you got to, of course, take your picture and do the tourist thing. But our group goes beyond that, and we get in a circle, and we get our crystals out, and we om and set intentions and bring the energy field, because I said we were on a mission, not a vacation, to activate the grid. And from there, you walk down. Yeah, 150 people from all around the world were a part of this adventure. You know, so much parts of the world were all represented. It was an amazing group of people who were like-minded. And so you walk the trail down, and you'll eventually come to the entrance of the walled area of the city of Machu Picchu, and walk through the entrance gate, and you start to feel the magnificence of this whole creation. And you look down the sides, and you know the terracings to hold all that stuff up, and you know probably used for agriculture also. But I mean, look at those terraces. It's like a marvel to reckon. And you know, with terracing like that, anything you do above is going to be highly stable because it's been squared off and walled, and it's going to make an incredible place for building up above. And we're looking right now toward the main temple, of what the remains of the main temple was, and on top of that hill there's an astrological type of device up on top of that hill. It was also used. And flowing at the top of this mountain are springs flowing forth with water flowing through. You know, it would disappear, come back up other places. It was about the water again, and this water is still flowing 12,000 years later through the same portals. Like, you look at the size of the blocks and just the workmanship, and you look around at the marvels of some of the craftsmanship, you know, and using natural rocks and having other on top and curved around for these turrets, and you know, just a masterpiece of design and resonance. You see stairways carved into the rock, a little worn down over the time. We used the wooden stairs to the side, but you know, it's carved into the solid rock. And you see the chambers, and 2-story chambers, you know, of like, you know, the walls coming in at that certain angle. They all do at the same angles, you know, creating that same angle of the windows, the same angle of the walls coming in, not just straight up and down, like masterful of resonance. The doorways leading through, and you can see the technology here of where obviously there was some sort of door there. You can see little hinge type things on the side, right? And or some sort of hinge device where they carved into the rock, right? And you see above, you see a place where maybe they had some rope where they were lifting things up as part of the gate and the doorway. Long since gone, but the rock remains as a thing. You know, doorways leading to incredible views, you know, all of which holding that angle and the resonance. More all over the place, you see places for tie downs and hinges and not anything ordinary. It's interesting when the rocks are pulled apart a little over time, you can get your hand in there and you can feel how the two surfaces all follow each other like this as they're going down. You can feel how they were put in a semi-liquid state, and then they would harden and they would form, you know, the dimension of each other to the point where you couldn't even get a credit card in it except where they moved like this. And along the roofs, you see these knobs sticking out here that were used probably for tying the roofs down. And the Temple of the Three Windows, as they call it, one of the icons of Machu Picchu. And then there was the central temple. And And again, the place where the biggest stones, the biggest rock, actually shows a sign of the most destruction. You know, it's the only place you see in all of Machu Picchu where the wall has fallen like that, you know, sign of the cataclysm. And the other walls are blown apart. And you look at that whole piece and, you know, every place else, everything is held in perfect form. It hasn't sunken, but this one spot here is sunk and pulled over, and the roof was blown and the other walls were blown off. And the interesting place to me, because I'm always looking for this as I'm going through, is the area they call the quarry. And it's some random looking rocks that have all sorts of flattened areas and carvings and stairways and funny things on it. And some of the rocks show sign of vitrification and randomness. And they, you know, try to say this is where the Inca quarried their stone from. No, actually, the stones for this place came from the other side of the valley, you know, and were floated over. The only way you got the stones didn't come from there. They came from the other side of the valley in the quarry. They know where the quarry was. It's often obvious where the stones were quarried from. So this area they call the quarry is what I saw was the place where the main energy center was, because it shows a sign of the most destruction, the most randomness and vitrification, liquefaction of some of the rocks with the glassy layers over it. So I have got, as usual, kind of a different point of view on what these places were and how they were used. And from there we took this incredible hike to a place called Montana, which means montaña, which means mountain in Spanish. We call it Montana. It's montaña. And, you know, again, they call us the Inca Trail. Well, I'm sorry, the Inca didn't build this. What you see here, when we build a trail, we carve into the hillside, right, and try to make a flat area to do our things. They don't do that. They bring in a whole bunch of stones and pile them up from down below to make a stable base from the ground level. And you can see that's all rock stone wall on this sheer hillside here in order to make that trail, you know, to go to the top of this mountain. It's a magnificent trail. It's wide. It's not just a little path. And engineering-wise, I was really fascinated with like huge stones at the bases to make them super stable in the way they were done and the way they were stacked up from below, not carved into the side of the hillside as we would do it. You know, and you can really see the flavor of, you know, well, these, again, a lot of these stones didn't come from here. They didn't just randomly found them. They came from that quarry on the other side of the mountain, floated in here and laid in a perfect way. And you look at just, you know, 12,000 years later, how incredible these stonework really is. You know, and the steepness of the hills to create this sort of pathway is like an engineering marvel without dynamiting the side of the hill and creating little flat areas. And when you look at the stones, they're big bases, and they actually, the stone above it lays on it to balance it out. So the stone above it sits at the base so they overlap, you know, in order to make it stable, which is how they're able to still be there thousands of years later. They weren't just little stones done. They were big stones laid with incredible intention. And as you go up, you get that iconic view of Machu Picchu from above and Huayna Picchu on the other side of that hill. And when you zoom in and look at it, you'll see incredible terraces and temples on the top of that incredible peak. All right? Yes, there were 2,500 steps that we took in order to get that in the, quote, Inca Trail. I don't think so. And then you get near the top, and there's this cut in the side of the hill. It wasn't just a natural cut. You can see where they actually carved that little cut through there in order to make this last cut to the spot where you get to the very top. And you get to the very top, and what do? You get your picture taken. We made it. That was quite a hike up there. At that elevation, you really huff and puff and realize, you know, the height of what you are. And then look around and try to figure out now, this is incredible pathway, and it leads to what? This flattened area on the top, a terraformed flattened part of an incredible high peak of a mountain, and it was like, what did they put this incredible trail to this point right here to do what up here? Why, what was it? And so after the group left, I stayed up there because I just I've got up here. I'm going to meditate and really tune into this whole thing and get the vision of, what was this all about? And Nassim talks about that a spaceship, if it comes close to the ground, is unstable. They can't actually land on the ground. It's just the same reason we put our power lines up high, because you put the power down low, the static electricity will shoot the energy and ground out the power. So we put our power lines high. It was the same with a ship. If they come close to the ground, they're unstable. So here's this peak of a mountain where there's hardly any mass, and the vision I saw was the ships hovering above this spot in order to send supplies in and out and hover and be, so they could be close to the ground level, so they could actually function, but have no mass underneath them, so they wouldn't be unstable. So that's kind of the picture I saw of, what was this used for? And also seeing the vision of the stones floating in from the quarry and just going, with CNC precision, computer-driven precision of laying those stones and figuring it all out in a magnificent way. So at this point, we made our venture on to Bolivia. We got in buses, and Cusco is high, 11,000 feet, but you get to, in Bolivia, Lake Titicaca, you're 13,000 feet. Okay, this mountain, Haleakala, is 10,000 feet. I'll give you an idea. Mount McKinley, the highest point in America, in Alaska, is something like 14,000 feet. So we're up there. So we took a bus so people wouldn't be shocked to make that whole piece. And this is a Viracocha Temple of Bolivia, one of the most important temple areas in Bolivia. And what you see is the base rocks below, but the archaeologists came through and they decided they had their vision of what the rest of it looked like, so they stacked up a bunch of adobe and said, this is what the rest of it looked like. And I don't know if you guys got the full vision. I mean, this is the idea of what they thought it looked like, and they put that central wall back in. But again, modifying it, thinking they got it down and trying to do something new with it. But here's a temple complex from the air to kind of see how vast it is, and these big circular things and farmland, and again, everything was about the water. Every place you see these is the water was flowing from a temple up in the mountain, charged up and going through. And once again, the Twin Falls still flow perfectly even. That rock is perfectly flat across thousands of years later. And everywhere where the ruins, the pre-Inca ruins are, the Catholics came and plunked their church down right in the power center. Everywhere you see, they stole the rocks from things they tore down. They built their own churches right there, as magnificent as they are, plumped right down at the power spot, saying, okay, now this is ours. But what was interesting at this place is there was a shaman woman, and their family used to live at the temple until the archaeologists said we didn't want anybody living in there anymore. And they became the guide for us to talk through, and they started talking stories about the ships that would land there and the beings that would come. And she sat on her bus and talked all sorts of stories, and it's just, particularly her father, who was with the ships, her who's, had contact. And one of the most amazing stories was she was talking about these beings, 100 of them that came and were marching through, and the little humanoids with an elephant-looking head and big ears looked like little Ganeshas, 100 little Ganeshas marching along. And she was still a little girl at the time, and she would get scared when she saw it, and they would twinkle at her and twiddle their ears and stuff and try to humor her and make her happy. And So she came with us on our trip to be our shaman and do ceremonies with us. Quite randomly came in our group and became a part of it. And the next place we traveled was this portal, a gateway to the gods, as they called it. Carved from the side of the mountain, there's this incredible gate carved and this little keyhole portal. And the local lore has all sorts of legends of people going through that portal to another dimension, some of whom coming back or not coming back. And so all the local legends, everything knows this is a portal to another dimension on the side of this mountain carved there. So here's Nassim getting ready to take a flying leap and dive through it. It didn't quite work. Here's Bruce trying to ohm his way into the other side of that. Damn, I'm still here, man. Maybe the crystal will charge it and I can get that through there. No. But boy, when you were in it, you really felt this energy of a feel of like, some people felt up energy, other people felt down energy, but everybody who really tuned in and was quiet enough to feel that felt energy of this as a highly charged, very important place on this planet. And possibly a portal to the underworld, to the intraterrestrials. Like I said, this planet is hollow. Imagine it like a giant geode with a central sun in the middle and a big crystalline world on the inside. And the intraterrestrials are the ones that fly in the plasma ships that morphs and change in color. The extraterrestrials come in hard ships that they ordered on galactic eBay. But the ones inside are like one with their ship, and those are the ones that morph and change in color, and the orbs that you sometimes see are, according to Nassim, the intraterrestrials, a very high-level race that's living inside the planet, and when the cataclysm happened and the surface of planets sometimes don't quite work out, things happen on the surfaces of planets, but the real thing going on is inside the planet. So we know there's life and stuff on Mars. Well, maybe the real is inside of Mars. And same, inside our planet. So the beings who are really high when we shapeshift went into the Earth, changed form, went into the Earth and became the intraterrestrial species who have been the guardians of this planet for thousands of years and who we're now starting to have contact with, and things are going to change. Lots of things are shaping up on the South Pole. I just want to say, I know some of you got to go, that I'm going to record this and make a YouTube channel. You can see the one on Egypt by Bruce Douglas, Egypt, or Ancient Egypt download of Nassim. You can Google that or YouTube it and find the video, and I'll be doing the same with this one, putting on my Bruce Douglas channel, and you'll be able to find and get the instant replay. That Nassim's work is incredible. He's got resonance.is. You can go to that website, see all sorts of YouTube's information. It's really important to support him. These crystals are $1,200, but they're powerful, and the work goes to support his work. So encouraging everyone to support Nassim and his work. So this is Lake Titicaca. And they got these love boats out there that cruise the tourists around. So with our 100 people traveling, we got a whole boat, and we went off to the island of the sun and the island of the moon in the middle of Lake Titicaca. And you come out to the island, and like everywhere you see these terraces, not the spectacular ones like you saw before, but everywhere is terraced. And I imagine myself, what's this terracing about? There's so much energy in terracing all around Lake Titicaca, all around the Sacred Valley of Peru, and all around Cusco, all this terracing. Well, imagine if that hadn't been terraced 12,000 years ago, and then they would graze their llamas on the side of it, and all the wheat would come off, or the first drought and the rain would come and wash all the soil off, and you wouldn't be able to have life in that area. So what a gift that all these hillsides were terraced, so it's holding the soil, thousands of years later, and preventing the soil erosion and making it possible for life and even grazing animals on all these hillsides. And there was this incredible in the Temple of the Sun on the Island of the Sun. And it's not the fine work you see other places, but you know, you look at it and you realize, no, the Inca didn't build that. Those forms are still formed. Big heavy rocks up on top. Portals going into a chamber, which is obviously a resonance chamber. And even those hold that same frequency. The resonance within those are really incredible. And you see these little rooms with these same little chambers. And the ceilings are dome-shaped, still holding up all these years later with these big stones in the top holding the dome. Yeah, I bet. And then there's another spot where there's this Inca stairway, but it's not Inca, it's pre-Inca stairway with water. And at the very top is an incredible spring they call the Fountain of Youth. And it was very famous all over Peru and Bolivia as having very magical special powers. So the daughter of our shaman was there and did ceremony with each person to experience the Fountain of Youth and youthify. And even the children got to play with the 64 tetrahedron, much to their surprise. It was like, whoa! Like, they really tuned into this. It's like, whoa, what is this? And up there they had things to show the tourists, you know, how it was built. You know, they didn't have trees. The eucalyptus trees you see now were like brought in the late 1800s. And they had these shrubby trees that were not tall and straight to build from. So they had a lot of reeds growing in the lake. And so they made their houses out of reeds to show how that would look. Okay, it had plywood doors on it, so they cheated a little. And show you how the boats were also made out of reeds. And later you'll see big versions of that. And, of course, you got to have your petting zoo to hang out with your llama and your baby llama and get a little kiss from a llama until they eat your shirt. And then we got back in the boat and we go to the Island of the Moon. And the Island of the Moon had a very incredible temple in it. Now, it had two sides to it. On one side, they rebuilt what they thought the entrance looked like in adobe. So you can get a feel for how it must have been when the stonework was all perfect. So that's a rebuild inside. But on the other side, and there's how it looked as a close-up, the other side was left natural, probably in better shape, and you can really feel, you know, this dimensionality. And, you know, again, going into a shrine spot. What were those shrines for? That was for the plasma spheres to be held, and the energies, you know, that was operating everything. And you look up above and you see all sorts of chambers and spots. And you get to a powerful place like this, and what do? You do a ceremony. In this case, our shaman led a whole ceremony. And the men were a circle on the outside, and the ladies were inside, you know, with their feet out toward the center, and doing a whole special ceremony. We also held our crystals and had an om and charged the area up with some mana and some energy. Down below, you see the wall, the retaining wall holding the whole area up with some incredible technologies holding that up. And, of course, the pinnacle of Bolivia was Tiahuanaco. And there's probably several layers of civilizations represented here. This was like the center of the Lake Titicaca area civilization. And so it kind of shows, this is a penetrating ground radar imagery where you see, you know, basically a big pyramid with a big hole in the center of it. You see the temple, which has been partly restored. In front of it, you see this Sunken Temple. And all around it, there's all sorts of sites that you can see with ground penetrating radar. They've only begun to uncover what was really there. Even understanding what the pyramid was or why the center of it was blown out. So here's a photo of how it looks now, with the pyramid and half blown out and the temple being restored on the side. And just a piece of the whole archaeology that's actually been uncovered. So there's what they think it looked like. And I don't think they quite got it right. But this is what they started to rebuild in order to say this is how it looked and what they found. So that's all that's left of the original pyramid. And Nassim and all of us kind of felt like this is much older than the 12, 15,000 year civilization. This could have been a 30, 40,000 year old civilization. Because the number of pyramids all over this planet are phenomenal. They're popping up everywhere. You know, mountains that we thought were a mountain like in Bosnia, you know, they suddenly said, oh my God, that's the world's largest pyramid. And now they're looking at Mount Kailash in Tibet. And of course it's pyramid shaped, and locals always called it a pyramid, but we're starting to find out, oh my God, it really is even the largest pyramid. You know, and in fact, here's the quarry over here where they cut the top of the mountain off to quarry the stones to build it. So we're finding that underwater in China, you know, Bimini, you know, and this stuff could be way before the 12,000 year. That's just when that civilization ended in the cataclysm, but there have been other colonizations and firing up the grid on this planet before that, and this could have been some of that. So here you see, you know, pieces of what they've excavated and what's left, and some reconstructions as they try to put it all back together again. You know, the lake level has changed over the years too, so there's been erosion patterns and sedimentation that happens as the river rises, the lake level has risen and the lake level has dropped. In fact, there's a whole area off the Temple of the Sun that's underwater, you know, from when the water levels were lower 12,000 years ago, before the cataclysm. And that's like a magnificent city that Jacques Cousteau did some whole, you can Google that, that's all sorts of information about that coming out. And then there's the Sunken Temple that's really interesting because it has all these little figurine faces that kind of look like little E.T. dudes. I'm not always sure if those weren't actually placed there later, because I'm looking at some of them and it looks like someone popped out the rock and popped these in somewhere along the line. So who exactly knows exactly what it is, but you know, this one, our shaman woman, when she saw that, she just went into a whole reaction because she said, that's what the beings look like that I've seen from the ships landing at the temple where I have lived all these years. You know, and she was just totally taken and just like went into shaking and shudders when she saw this particular one. So this is looking from the Sunken Temple at the reconstructed area. And this is what this is what all around are these pillars rising up. Kind of looks like something in Glastonbury, right? So the whole ring is these big stones that are like tuning forks with rock in between, and they rebuilt those. And, you know, again, this is a reconstruction. It didn't quite feel right, but that's how they reconstructed and rebuilt it. And it's looking at the whole piece. That's like the iconic piece of the rebuilding of Tiahuanaco. But the power, these big stones rising up, you know, my feeling is like those are the ancient things, and then later generations put rocks between them in order to fill them in, because they feel like two different, completely different generations of stuff. The iconic piece is the Gateway of the Gods. This was laying down, and they found it there, and they put it back up again. But this was the citadel of what it is, the portal to the other dimension as they look at it. And this is their creator god in the creation mythology. This is the guy that came and did all this. and what he looked like. And all around it are all sorts of angel winged creatures all the way around it. And as we were going through, there was some stones that were so smooth on one side. It was like you put your hand on it, it was like glass. It was so smooth, just like polished to incredibleness. And we don't even have the technology to pull something like that off to polish it, because the stone would crumble. You'd have to actually vitrify it, plasmify it to smooth something like that. You also see all sorts of these type of things around. And this, which they had standing up as a doorway, but when I did it, it felt more like a sarcophagus like we saw in Egypt. And the sarcophaguses of Egypt were actually not for burying pharaohs. That's what they did in dynastic Egypt. But their original function was capacitor chambers to hold the singularities. That would often be lined on the inside and outside with gold and silver and conductive materials. Be non-conductive in the middle. They're capacitors to hold the charge of a singularity, and that's what I felt this was. And there was this other incredible figure that they had marched and taken all the way to La Paz, and then they decided that was kind of a bad idea and they should return it back to Tiahuanaco. So they returned it and built this incredible building. But what was amazing is this little guy right here of an incredibly dense stone, not found anywhere around there, which incredibly smooth. Would have been incredibly hard to carve something like that. And right next to it is Puma Punku. And that's, again, just beginning to be uncovered and unearthed. Famous for these very, incredible carving in these huge stones that are just, the rubble of it is really amazing, but what it must have been before, the famous H stones that have been a mystery to everybody, and what it is and what they could have been used for. Each one's different. They weren't like a mold. Everyone has a completely different height and form and density. So the big stones and the detail work of the carving is just off the scale at Puma Punku. Here's an excavation where they're just finding things. They haven't done a lot of excavating, and everywhere they look, you're finding things under the ground. And when we looked at Puma Punku, we looked at these things that they kind of claimed are the base stones. And we really looked at it and says, you know what? That's actually the roof. That's the top of it, and everything else is still underneath. In fact, this roof looked like it had blown over like this and flopped over the other way, because everywhere around it was a way where this huge stone would have set on top of things and have little pin marks and lock and pins, And so we decided a lot of what we're looking at on the rubble right here is actually the roof, and the main stuff is still underground. And what it comes up with. You see these little keyways. You see them in Peru and Bolivia. You see them also in Egypt. And, they try to say, well, what were these used for? Well, what Nassim says is when you have two pieces of stone and you're making a resonator, you want those stones to conduct energy, electricity between them. So these keyways are actually filled with bronze, conductive material, in order to connect the energy between. It wasn't like lock pins or tongue and groove, because none of that makes sense. The only explanation that really made sense is Nassim's. And the Inca mainly had copper, but every now and then they have a little bit of bronze that they use for weapons or use for something. And he thinks that this is where the bronze actually came from. They found these and mined them and said, oh, cool, we'll reform it and make something harder than copper out of, because they had a little bit of bronze, but they had a lot of gold and silver and copper and soft metals. And bronze was the hardest they had. And you even see this like little groove right here, it looks like really fine machining with these little teeny weeny holes. It looks like they run electrical conductor wires or something through that. It was like, wow, what was this used for? Underground, fresh excavations just a few years ago. And everywhere you see this symbol here, you see that as a symbol of the Inca, they say, a symbol of the pre-Inca. And Nassim had his theory as to what this was. If you take a 64 tetrahedron and you put it in there at just the right angle, the outer ring of the 64 tetrahedron makes this symbol. So the flower of life, the Sri Yantra, the symbol of the Inca, all the same thing, representing the underlying structure of the vacuum that everything arises from and is. So Puma Punku is almost like a raised ground. Around it is lower. It really lets you know it might be just the peak of the cap. And down below, it's almost like it was a pyramid. You see, and sometimes they'll put an old pyramid and they'll put something newer on top. You see that. So, of course, this is our final ceremony with our 364 tetrahedrons. Nassim in the Buddha relaxing mode. And our final ceremony of activation of these incredible places. Back to Puno and the people who are still left, our little final celebration, getting to appreciate all the people that we traveled with and had this incredible, and there's so much more to show you, but this is the highlights that I picked out that I felt would be relevant for greater understanding of what was going on. Our shaman and saying her adieus, sending her back to her temple and land, and appreciations for everything she brought and wisdoms and understandings that she imparted on what the Pachamama concepts of everything we're seeing is. And saying our adieus to Nassim on the shores of Lake Titicaca. And as we went back into Puno, into town to kind of check it out, there's a central square, and what did we find around the central square? Well, are they trying to tell us something that they know? Like, okay, there's a lot of ships around here, and this is kind of what they look like, and hello, it's we know it's time for archaeology and everybody else to get off this thing and thinking all this stuff was built, by a culture that only had copper tools, and total archaeology on crack. I don't know what those guys are smoking, but I don't want to smoke that stuff. Stuff they come up with and the stories of how they think these things were built were just hilarious. And then I went into Cusco and in Puno, and then I heard this military sounding music, and I hiked down the street to the central square, and a few days earlier they had a general strike. And they shut everything down, and our buses couldn't leave that morning until after the strike kind of cleared. And then we heard 5 people were killed. And 5 days later, this military whole parade thing happens. Doing the Hitler high step. That was quite a shocker after all the peaceful stuff and everything to kind of experience of that. And it really, it put me through this emotional feelings, of this occupied people and the domination of military and the military dictatorships they've lived through, and what the Incas were and represented before as a peaceful people. That, they had their empire grew, but not out of force. Their empire grew by, providing services for people and education and saying, here's all the benefits if you want to join us. They didn't force people. They didn't change their ways. They didn't dominate, and it was a peaceful world without a monetary system, without money, where you gave a certain amount of food you grew so they could take it to other places that maybe didn't have enough food. And what the world's come to now and what we really need to learn to get rid of this competitive, species that we've become, and become a cooperative species again, where we're working together for the betterment of everybody and not for the domination. So the trip being over, we went and we're tourists. Here's those reed boats they make, and they're all made out of reeds, and you go to the floating islands, which are made by reeds. They put layers and layers of reeds down and make these islands, which are kind of a tourist attraction. And you look at the front of the boat, and there's this oarsman here oaring it down through the whole thing, but then you look at the backside, and there's a motorboat back there actually pushing it. But what the heck, at least we got there a little faster, and the floating islands, and what the villages and stuff could have been like way back when. Only now they got metal roofs and satellite towers, but it's very pastel and beautiful feeling out on the lake to be there. And we ran across this thing, which was kind of like a stadium. It has a whole field and had all these things cut in the side in the mountain, for bleachers to stand and look. And they had a central area where obviously the High Muktimak sat, and probably the Singularity was above them, and the place where the high people sit in front of that. And you can imagine some sort of games or stadium type of thing happening there. And up above, there was a high area going way above it with the usual blown out, melted type of stone up above where something was there, and it looks like it melted everything down. And you see that everywhere. And then, of course, on the shores of Lake Titicaca, we found this incredible little village built by a German guy who's a sculptor and a carpenter, and built his fantasy world to be able to stay of spirals, we're all into that, so all the Nassim people, a bunch of us went there and stayed, and we did some incredible medicine journey there too. Some ayahuasca, and to be on the shores of that and this powerful medicine circle, I really wanted to see visions of what that culture looked like 12,000 years ago, and what it was, what it represented. And I really got a chance to see the ships, and I saw the beings, and I saw the plasma sphere. And at one point, the brothership handed me one of the spheres and said, "Okay, now you can create with it, and see what you can do." And I'm sitting there having architectural gasms, creating stuff, and powerful place to be. Here's the guys who helped build that place, very proud of their construction, which was really a relief after all the kind of ugly cities of concrete and brick and horrible stuff. And as we were leaving the town, there was a general strike again, and they shut down the roads, and we had to hike for about 45 minutes through the roadblocks and stuff. No police anywhere, dirt across the roadblocks, and we ran across this right here where people were obviously two sides of an argument were sitting across from each other, each in their native costumes, and a moderator in the middle, and the women and the villagers all like standing around watching. And I thought how peaceful this was. They're working it out. Yes, they had a strike, they have an argument, but they're saying we're going to sit here, we're going to work it out. No police, no guns, no military, native people working out their differences, and cool umbrellas, yeah. And then back to Cusco before we depart. And this was the place where the Temple of the Sun, the most important spot of all of Cusco, used to sit. The walls are still there, but it was whatever was remaining from it was completely torn down by the Spanish, who spent 100 years building their own cathedral out of the very rocks they tore down of the most important part of all of Cusco, where the power center and the religious center of all of Cusco was. So you can really feel that, injustice of what happened and where it was. And then I said I'd come back and say, what's those little bumps you see all over the place in the bottom of those? Well, I finally realized what it was, and I consulted with Nassim, and he says, I like that one. That's the best explanation I've heard yet. Just like when you're blowing glass, right? You got the glass blower, and you're pulling it away at the very end, and what do you end up with? You end up with a little blip on the end, that you got to deal with. And so I said, that's just a blip from pulling away the energy field from the from the stone. As you're plasmifying it, makes a little blip at the end. No great significance. It's just the blip that happens. So that's my story. The question was the shaman that had the experience with the extraterrestrials. She said the ships that landed there on a regular basis, she showed the places where they would land, the beings that would come out, but only certain people could actually see them. They'd come at night when there weren't any people around. And they would, they would come and be able to do healings to the people. And her mom, the shaman woman, had actually been taken up in a ship before. And when she came back, she had healing powers, being able to touch and heal the people of the villages. And from that, she became a powerful woman in that village and did all sorts of things to help them, like create a place where they could sell to tourists and organize good running water going to every places, and did a lot of things for her village right there, which was one of the things. And she was one of the few women shamans. Most of the shamans around there are men, and she was one of the few that has come forth as a woman. The orbs are part of the intraterrestrial species. When you come out of the earth, unless you shapeshift, you have to kind of be in a bubble. So the orbs you sometimes see, right? And often we get them in photos. We don't actually see them, but the photo, since they're blipping in and out, they're too fast for us to see. So they blip in and out of reality, and in a film you catch it. And the same thing with a lot of ET ships. Many people in our crew were taking pictures, and you see the little lights, and you'd see the ships, and you see those discs and stuff floating around these temples. You don't see them in your physical because they move very quickly, Nassim says, but the film actually catches them. They're supposed to be cloaked. There's a cloaking order on this planet now, according to Nassim. If the ships or anybody being here, they're not actually supposed to be seen by us, because we're supposed to think we're the center of the universe and we're trying to find God within. We're supposed to grow up without outside interference. So for the last 2,000 years, there's been a cloaking order on this planet to hide yourself if you're going to appear until we're ready, or for those who have the perception or are ready to see. The big-headed ET dudes, well, those were the beings who they called the sun gods, the gods. They were the extraterrestrials that were there, that were part of that 12,000 year civilization, who that interbred with humans and created the hybrids that I talked about that were in between, and then slowly the skulls and everything come back down. Actually, Nassim has just pulled a tooth out of one of those and is going to do some carbon dating, because oftentimes things will get dated, and then that material, the archaeologists don't want this information getting out. There's this whole thing of trying to act like everything happened the last 2,000 years, and the Incas did all this, and they're very attached to that and don't want any competition. But there has been some dating, like that mummy has been dated to, I think it was 15,000 years. Thank you for coming.